Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is just after 5:30, so we will call to order. Mr. Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum.
Okay, thank you. We have no addeds. I'm just going to skip down the list. No disclosures of potential pecuniary interest. No briefings, no petitions. Okay, so we'll skip right to Committee of the Whole. So first up, we have a motion to resolve into Committee of the Whole to participate in the International Association for Public Participation Decision Makers Training Session.
Moved by Councillor George, seconded by Councillor Osanek, that Council resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole to participate in a training session with respect to the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2.
Please vote. And that carries. So we do have, we're now in Committee of the Whole. We do have one information report. And so Debbie Miller, Manager of Communications and Public Engagement, will introduce Richard Delaney, President, Principal Collaborative Decisions International Association for Public Participation. Debbie.
Good evening and welcome to the International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, Decision Maker Training Session for Council and Senior Leaders. As the engagement framework was developed over the past 2 years with input from residents, council, and city employees, we reviewed many other municipal documents on public engagement as part of the process. Most major municipalities across the country have adopted the IAP2 approach and customized it to their municipality. After the public engagement framework was adopted on October 3rd, the implementation plan became the focus for rolling out public engagement in a consistent manner. Training and awareness was included in the implementation plan for public engagement. Today, we started the intensive staff training for 29 staff members with the IAP2 planning and techniques training. The training that staff are taking consists of 2 90-minute webinars, 2 full days of planning for public engagement, and 2 full days of techniques for public engagement. During the winter, there will be a second group of approximately 25 employees that will take the training again. Directors are taking the same training that's being done tonight for you in December as well, so the decision maker training as well. Everyone has a role to play with public engagement. Through IAP2, there is a right way to engage the public. Thank you for being here for the decision maker training. And now I would like to introduce you to Richard Delaney of Delaney & Associates, who will be the facilitator for tonight's session. Enjoy.
Great, thank you, Richard. And just before you begin, if you're okay to take questions as we go, that might be an easier approach. Is that okay?
Absolutely. In fact, I was going to canvass the group to find out how they wanted to proceed. Okay. So we have a manual, we have a slide deck. This particular orientation session, I think, is designed for a group who is perhaps a little lower on the learning curve than this group. So I'm very open to be as flexible as you want to be.
Okay. So with the consent of council, rather than doing things in a more formal briefing where we would have the whole briefing and questions at the end, if we can, Richard, we'll just give you the floor, and then if you have questions, then he can just, we'll just go from there. So
absolutely.
Thank you. You have the floor.
Yes, I have a question already. There was some mention of a webinar. Would that be available to members of council as well? You mentioned a 90-minute. Yeah. If that would be made available to us on council, that would be great.
Yes, we can make that available through the clerks. Thanks.
So those 2 webinars cover the first full day of a 5-day program. And they were very interactive, and the staff was very engaged, and I think there's a lot of excitement about rolling out the framework. I think staff are quite grateful for the opportunity to take the training. This is training that IAP2 developed back in 1999, 2000. It has been reviewed and updated 4 times since. Every time it's been reviewed and updated, it has been done so through a worldwide engagement of public participation professionals like myself and Debbie. And so the training that staff is getting is really a best practice training. It consists of about 15 to 20% of theory, and then there's 2 days of planning in terms of needs analysis, objective setting, goal setting, that kind of thing, and then 2 days of design. And that is, once you have a plan, how do you configure your engagement with stakeholders in order to make sure that they get to be involved to the extent that's reasonable, practical, and desirable in a way that informs decision-making to improve the quality of the decision. So that's the kind of work that we've been doing, and those are the objectives of that training. I'd like to start by actually thanking Debbie. I met Debbie 2 years ago. She was in a session that I did, I think in Toronto, Vancouver. And we had some wonderful conversations, and she told me about the work that you were doing, and I'm so pleased and proud to be here to close the loop and follow up and meet you and the staff and to be part of this exciting journey. Also, thanks to Dennis for all of the great support and oversight that he's been providing to shepherd this whole process through. What you're doing here is, I would say, in the top 5% of municipalities across the country and even around the world. Those municipalities, those organizations that take this generic international model and customize it to their needs and the needs of their stakeholders is truly the hallmark of an evolving organization in terms of creating trust-based relationships with their stakeholders and moving to the whole organization to the next level of performance. So as mentioned, I'm going to skip through the manual and the slides. So the slides map to the manual, and you have some resources with you. I'm going to step away from the podium here. So you have a number of resources. As I mentioned, the manual is a bit of a reference guide. There's lots of white space there. It maps to the slides. Debbie has the slides if you want hard copies of those, whatever. But in the manual, if you make notes and if there's something that is of particular relevance to you and you want to follow up, we've provided you with these little labels that are not only blatant self-promotion, but they're also tabs that you can use to fold over the edge of a page and refer back to some genius that you've written through the course of the evening. There is a little card here that talks about IAP2 Canada. I think it's important for me to pause and tell you a tiny bit about the organization and how it evolved and why it is seen as the worldwide leader in authentic engagement. So a bit of the history on public participation at a conference, and it was actually a planning conference back in Denver in 1992. There were 2 individuals from Ottawa, Canada, and 2 individuals from Denver, Colorado, that were at this conference, and they were planners, but they were principally engagement professionals. And they said, it's just crazy that we don't have a professional association or organization that we can network through, that we can actually get learning products from and develop standards and that kind of thing. And so in 1992, they incorporated a not-for-profit professional association, so that's why it's actually incorporated in the city of Denver under the state laws of Colorado, because that's where it actually, that's where the association crystallized. So back in 1992, we had 4 members, and now we have about 7,300 in 17 different countries today. And the organization has grown principally because of the work of a cast of volunteers that have developed the protocol and then morphed that into this 5-day training program. The training program has now become the first of 3 building blocks for, we have now in Canada a professional designation called Certified Professional Public Participation Professional, or what is known as CP3. So that was rolled out last year in Canada. It was rolled out in the United States 3 years ago. The model is being replicated around the world. Australia is next, and then the UK. So the program of training, formal training that staff are getting now situates them to be able to go forward and get those credentials. One of the things that's interesting about the work that we do in this space in municipalities, last year the cities of Regina and Winnipeg actually put as a mandatory requirement in their contracting documents that people who are going to undertake work for those cities must have taken this training. That was met with a fair degree of resistance by a lot of the planning, engineering, and design professionals in those cities, and it was rolled back. But when it was rolled back, the communication out to those, the contracting community in those cities was that we will rescind that mandatory requirement for a period of 2 years. And it's been a wonderful development for business, I have to tell you that. So there are lots of municipalities who have adopted this, and they're actually hardwiring it into their procurement requirements. And the reason for that is quite simple. They want their contractors to be able to talk the same language as staff. They want their contractors to actually be able to pick up your framework and apply it through the course of the work that they do. It goes to consistency. It goes to creating a trust-based relationship with your stakeholders and creating certainty around process through consistency of application. So those are some of the developments that I think you would be interested in as a kind of a backdrop for our discussions this evening. Any questions about the organization? The IAP2 is that international organization. They're a federation, by the way. So every affiliate, so Canada, the United States, the UK, Europe, Australasia, India, Africa, they all have what are called affiliate organizations. And that little postcard that I showed you gives you some information about IAP2 Canada. IAP2 Canada has about 1,600 members. So of those 7,300 members worldwide, 1,600 are Canadian, very active. Of the 38 trainers worldwide, 9 of them are Canadians. So we're quite active in this field. There are corporate memberships to IAP2, so it's something that you might be interested or staff might be interested in investigating. Okay, so I'll leave that there for now. IAP2 has international conference every year, and it alternates back and forth between Canada and the United States. So last year it was in Denver, Colorado, and next year, it's always in September, and next year it's going to be in Victoria. And so the purpose of those 2-day conferences is really just for professionals to meet, network, and it's a training opportunity as well. So if there are no questions or comments or observations about IAP2 and kind of situating the material, I'd like to dive into the material. Are we good to go? So, as I said, the slides track along with the manual. The manual is your reference guide. The purpose of this session is really just, it's not going to make you design experts, and in fact, we don't want to make you design experts. Staff are the experts in design, needs analysis, and planning. Throughout the planning protocol that staff are learning about today and tomorrow, and then again in December, there are five steps and 21 different activities. Each one of those activities, not each one of them, but most of them have worksheets or tools or templates. And they will do the work of the needs analysis, the environmental scanning, the kind of situational review, the stakeholder mapping, all of those things. That's a staff function. However, throughout those 21 different activities, there are 4 touch points to the decision maker. And I've heard through conversations with staff that a lot of times the decision maker is this group. And so one of the questions that they asked me to carry back to you is, and I'm not asking for you to answer this question like right now, is maybe through the course of the evening we can discuss this, is how should council be included in those touch points? And we'll get to what those touch points are, because there's so much engagement going on, and there's such a variety of engagement at different levels. It doesn't make sense that a formal presentation be made at each one of those 4 touch points for every engagement. So we need to somehow come up with an agreement in terms of how does council want to be kept in the loop and make sure that staff are developing, planning, and designing these engagements in a way that suits you, because at the end of the day, as the decision maker, you are the owner of those engagements. And you need to be comfortable with the design and the scope of those engagements. So we need to have some time to discuss that. There are 2 other questions that we talked about, and I think it behooves me to bring this to you. So I'll just put these questions out there, and maybe through the course of the evening we can talk about them. One of them goes to managing expectations. And in terms of this session, we'll talk about the spectrum of engagement and kind of what that means in terms of the intensity of the engagement. So the amount of resources that's required, and basically the amount of influence that you are giving to stakeholders to have a voice in that decision-making process. And so the question goes to, there are 5 levels on the spectrum. Not every engagement is going to be at the empower level or the collaborate level. And we'll talk about what that really means in a little while. But staff is very sensitive to the fact that you have a desire to be a very engaging council, a very engaging citizen. And that doesn't mean that every decision is going to be, or every engagement is going to be at the collaborate level or involve level, or even consult level for that matter. And so we need to figure out kind of how do we come to a collective appreciation of where we should be on the spectrum for each engagement as we go forward. There are some suggestions made within the protocol, and we'll customize them to meet the needs of all parties concerned. And I guess the third question that kind of came to me through the course of the conversation today with staff, and by the way, really hard questions. Really, there's some staff here who have some really great experience in engagement, and they're anxious to do more and better engagement. One of the things that came up was this whole notion of speaking truth to power. And so a lot of times they get into a situation with stakeholders, with residents, and part of the engagement process is simply to help people to navigate sort of that emotional territory to get to a place where they can have a reasoned conversation. Sometimes this is referred to as venting. And so there's some sensitivities around that. I mean, IAP2 has some suggestions in terms of how we can kind of create a space where that can be done in a logical, compassionate, and cost-effective way. And staff want some assurances that if they should follow those processes, that it would not be frowned upon by senior management or council. So some of that goes to getting an appropriate plan. Some of it goes to creating a space that is conducive to effective and focused dialogue. And some of it just goes to being firm with stakeholders. And it would be great if they could get some kind of message from this group that they have your permission, endorsement, and encouragement to actually be rigorous in terms of following your framework and making sure that that key stakeholders, that influencers in the community are not able to, on a regular basis, hijack conversations for their own interests. So rigor, firmness, authenticity, that's I think an important conversation to have, and I'm really happy that they raised it through the course of our conversations today. So those are the things that kind of came up for us today during our conversation, and if I can put those ideas into play, maybe we can address them through the course of the presentation this evening. Oh, and before I launch into that, so those are the questions that are interesting, from a staff perspective. What about you? What are some of the big things that you need to walk away with today in terms of if we haven't covered this or that, it won't have been a successful way to spend your evening?
Hi, thanks. My interest in public engagement Well, it's public participation, okay, but also the engagement side. So I know that it touches on it in some of the materials, and staff have done a really good job in their efforts to have public consultations to reach out to communities and people who might not normally be involved in a decision-making process or in an engagement type process. And so really what I want to get out of this is a little bit more of some strategies for getting people involved who aren't always involved, because it feels like that is an important part of the job, and I don't feel like I'm equipped to do it very well at the moment.
Thanks for putting that on the radar. So that group is, there are three, I think, types of stakeholders that would fall into the category of not regularly engaged or not really an engaging group of stakeholders. So the first one is what we refer to as the unsurprised apathetics. So those are people who, oh yeah, it's council, they meet every whatever, they make decisions, it's like, doesn't involve me. Until, in fact, they realize, because they've read on the front page of the paper, that it does involve them. And then, in fact, they're the ones who are sitting there and kind of caring loudly during a council meeting. So that's the first group. Second group is, in fact, the hard to reach, hard to serve. And those are vulnerable populations who really don't usually have the means to participate in a traditional way, and we have to work a little bit harder to get those folks involved, because if they are involved, they actually do have a right, a legitimate place at the table, so that the onus is on us. And the third group is almost the most important group, in the sense that they are what I refer to as the silent majority. So the silent majority are really those people who are positively impacted by the decisions that you make. They just don't know that they have a stake in it. And what happens is those loud voices that care loudly during a public hearing or a council meeting are actually, that is the process of watering down good public policy. And so getting stakeholders who are positively impacted in a decision is really difficult. And that's where you guys come in. That's where you can use your influence and the tools that you have. I mean, people read your tweets. I mean, if you blog, you have that kind of influence. You can convene, and we'll talk more about that. So thanks for putting that on the radar. Other things that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, thank you. Part of the public engagement strategy we're working on is expectations of the public and how to make that clear. Recently, we've had someone helping with contentious planning applications, public meetings, and she read an introduction about respect. And we don't have a standard introduction before public meetings to talk about this engagement strategy, and that part of it is that I will be civil to you, could you please be civil to me? A way of presenting that, saying it that it doesn't sound like we're putting people down or that we're, expecting trouble, but we just don't have an introduction right now that we do need in this city that does lay out the expectations for the public engagement.
Can we just deal with that? Because that came up today as well, and I think there was some conversation. So when Debbie and her team were putting this together, you had conversations with lots of residents, right? And that came up. Can you provide a little bit of background, maybe to kind of how that conversation went? And then we'll so this is really, really important.
Sorry.
So just so as Debbie, maybe you turn to page 4 of your framework, and it's a nice story to tell. So
For sure. So I'm also going to look to Lanny, and if you've got anything to jump in with here as well, because Lanny was very much involved in putting the framework together for the municipality. So the pieces with regards to the guidelines, we've developed posters as well that we're going to take to sessions. There's a banner as well, and then we can also work on developing some language around that we can use to introduce at the beginning with regards to the respect and laying out the guidelines as well, if you'd like. That was definitely a conversation that was had through the focus groups and through the input we received through all of the different sessions as well. So definitely an important piece of the framework.
So the shorthand on that is that when you, when staff, whoever is convening a public meeting, when they start, and Debbie and I were just talking before this meeting, that we're actually going to take a bit of a detour on our next session because staff is really interested in your point, and it goes to the point that the second question that I tabled on their behalf, and that is speaking truth to power. And so one of the roles of a meeting facilitator is actually to enforce the guidelines for the meeting. And they need assurances from you that if, in fact, somebody who is becoming very vocal, very assertive, and not sort of acting in the public interest, that they have your permission and encouragement to actually ask that person to leave the meeting because they are not following the guidelines that residents of Kingston developed. And so these are social norms. These are expectations that weren't developed by staff. They were developed by citizens, and that's their legitimacy. And I think that's an important consideration. So you do have that tool to kind of create a space where civil conversations can happen. So this is a very topical conversation. Sorry, that's a very topical conversation. Thanks for raising it. A follow-up?
Yes, I did read this afternoon, and and this is why I say it's going to be difficult to formulate an actual little statement in the beginning, because there's one, be open to all ideas. And I was thinking of the meeting that Councillor Rosanek and I sat through for Dawn House Women's Shelter, or that we've sat through for some other, particularly affordable housing, and the issue of those people comes up. Well, I don't want to be open to the idea that we don't want those people. So these are the kinds of fine lines we get into. So be open to all ideas. For me, it would be more like be respectful that everyone has an idea. Wordsmithing becomes important because we do have a citizenry who are very literate, very smart, and very quick to jump on anything that might offend their sensibilities, even in something like this, a guideline for participation. So any ideas you have that will help us with this?
So we will address the whole, the protocol that has been developed for planning and design addresses NIMBYism. And so, yeah, it goes to being well prepared and that sort of thing. So thank you for that. We'll talk more about this. Things that are important to you that you get out of our discussion this evening?
Yeah, basically, one of the things is, Yeah, so basically one of the things that I've always thought is, and some of the feedback I've gotten is we do a lot of consultation, but then the public's looking for, was it actually considered? How did it factor into the equation? And at the end of it, did they feel that they were actually heard? Because a lot of the times somebody may have an idea and there's numerous reasons why it's just not feasible, but if we don't communicate that properly, then they just go, what's the point in engaging? I told you my idea, never heard anything back, you didn't use my idea. So the next time we ask them their opinion, they just go, whatever, and they tune out. The second thing that I've kind of been pondering is we have very, very engaged groups, which is very, very good, but we also have a large percentage of the population that doesn't seem to engage. So when you ask for engagement, are you just simply hearing from the same, sort of groups over and over and over again, the same messages, and then they're getting more frustrated because they're not feeling heard, but you're also not reaching out to 85 to 90% of people who, for whatever reason, the biggest challenge I find is ask somebody their opinion on whether they like A or B, and you probably won't hear anything back. But tell them you've chosen B already without asking their opinion, and you will hear all the reasons why B is the wrong way. So how do you get around that where it seems like we're getting the feedback after the decision's already been made, and even though we're asking for the engagement beforehand? So those are just some of the challenges that I've kind of...
This touches on one of the other points that was raised before, and the protocol definitely addresses this concern, and we're going to cover that. I can guarantee that. So with that in hand, I'm going to launch into the materials. They call this a course. It's not really a course. It's a seminar. It's a discussion. I'm going to present some ideas. We're going to have a discussion about them, and I hope that kind of your comfort level with your role in the engagement process increases, and that there's some clarity around it, because as decision makers, you are stakeholders. You are core stakeholders.
On this topic, I would just like to maybe also ask you to put on the floor for consideration. How do we ensure that the process is seen to be sincere? We do an awful lot of public engagement, and sometimes the sentiment that may be in the room is that we're just going through the motions. Staff aren't really sincere. Staff really have an agenda already, so that sort of thing. And I know that that becomes all part and parcel of what I would say the credibility in the process. And also the two-way respect in terms of setting policy and getting input. And perhaps that sort of piggybacks on some of the comments that council have made.
So to your first point, it came up early on in our discussions today, and I will address it. It's a really important, one of the quotes that, so when we do our introductions at the beginning, people choose from a variety of quotes that they choose, and then they explain why they chose that particular quote. And one of the quotes is, community doesn't care how much you know, they want to know how much you care. And that actually was one of the most popular quotes that drew people to I think because there is a concern that sincerity is connected to credibility. Right? It's like, it's not a technical, artificial, sanitized process. It's a process whereby we want to hear about what's important to you, and we want you to be assured that we've heard you and we factored it into the decision-making process. And that goes to a point that we will absolutely deal with close to the end of my presentation, and it's all about follow-up and feedback. And it's something that every organization is weak on. Follow-up and feedback, weakness number one. Evaluation, weakness number two. So we need to talk about those things.
Looking at this information, it didn't take long to realize it's very good quality work. The first concern I had, though, was that through different technologies that are emerging in the world, for example, a Canadian company called Ethereum invented things called smart contracts, which will allow us to do things like have referendums any day we want for less than 50 cents all across Kingston. We'll be able to do that. Those types of technologies exist. They're just not used by the general public yet, but probably by the time the next term of council ends, they may be adopted. So one question I have is, how in tune will all of these things be with changing technologies? Because we're in our infancy right now, and the increase in technology won't be a gradual slope. It will be an elbow that goes straight up, where we would be able to have a referendum as quick as somebody could send a text message inside of 10 years. So even though this is incredible work, in 5 years, it may be very, very, very different. And the accessibility to the community will be exceptionally cheap and easy to do. So how do we make sure that we're not prepared, that we're prepared for that as it comes? Because it's going to come a lot quicker than we think.
Yeah, so how do we ensure that our policies and processes don't constrain the deployment of relevant technologies, right? So making place for them. Okay, thanks for putting that on the table. And I think Debbie can report that you're in the process of kind of upgrading your technology for engagement, but maybe I don't know everything that's involved there, but maybe you can speak to that when we get there in the presentation. So thanks for that. So this is a seminar, it's a discussion, and want really to provide some clarity in terms of those 4 touch points, your role. There is a role in encouraging and promoting engagement. One of the things that, so Ipsos used to do a biannual survey called Reinventing Democracy. It was really just a national survey that they would sell different questions to different levels of government. And they ran that for about 6 years. And in the last time that they actually ran that survey in 2012, it was very clear that when invited, a member of the public is 9 times more likely to attend an engagement event if they perceive that the decision maker is present. That's you. So clearly, if we want to get people engaged, your presence, your simple presence at the engagement is, in fact, something that will draw people into those conversations. And that doesn't have to be in person, that can be online, that can be as simple as tweeting out and promoting these kinds of opportunities for engagement. So there is a very clear role for decision makers, for council, and for executive all across the engagement life cycle. And so just in case you wanted to, that isn't, an artificial construct when we refer to the engagement life cycle. It is something that there is a lot of rigor and certainty in. So on page 8 of your framework, you can see that Kingston has, and I'm sure, well, you saw this, you adopted this several months ago, so it might be a distant flicker in your memory, but this protocol, or this engagement cycle, was directly adopted from the IEP2 protocol and customized for Kingston. So there is a rigor, there is a step-by-step approach, and it is proven. And it has not only been proven in municipal government, it's been proven effective at every order of government in Canada and in North America, certainly, and in every sector around the world. So transportation, mining, forestry, all of those kinds of sectors have used this protocol to help them plan through some authentic engagement. It's been used in court defenses, it's been used in litigation, that kind of thing, to demonstrate the authenticity or lack thereof. So we'll talk we'll talk about when we should use engagement and when we shouldn't. So this goes to one of the questions that staff had, and that is, how do we know we're on the right place in the spectrum? Because we're not always going to be at the collaborate level. And sometimes, if there's not enough time to do engagement properly, there would be more risk in initiating an ill-fated engagement than doing nothing at all. So sometimes our engagement, if we don't have the proper time, or if we're too far down in the decision-making process, we need to just say, sorry, the train has left the station and there is no room for engagement, and stay tuned, there will be opportunities for future decisions. So when to and when not to. I've been talking about your role and the commitment that you need to make on behalf of the city, and concepts that need to be considered, and these are top of mind for you. Those questions have already come up. So our agenda, clearly, I think it might be old school. We'll cover it quickly. We'll stop and just kind of raise your hand if you want to stop and explore those concepts or have a question or observation. So what is public participation, and what were the benefits of involving or not involving the public? Critical components and considerations. I want to spend some time here because that's top of mind for us now, because we're trying to get this process put in place in a way that is cost effective and meaningful for both the decision maker, for staff, and for residents. Your role in that, and of course, to sum up. So first part, what is public participation?
Sorry, excuse me. I just wanted to make a comment about something on that last slide there.
Please.
When to involve the public, and you spoke to it before. I think we need to acknowledge, before we go any further, that the hybrid model that we have here in Kingston, where the councillors work other jobs and are part-time councillors, means that we are members of the public, even when we're at council. So there is no time when we don't involve the public, because we're involved.
We are, yeah.
Unless we're not involved, which happens. So that would be a question to staff. When are you making decisions without involving council? But we can never not be members of the public unless we were full-time councillors. So you may notice points in your training where that hybrid reality that we represent we need to tailor for that.
So, well, let's have this conversation and come back to that, because this is directly related. This kind of concept that we want to talk about, what is public participation, is directly related to the observation that you just made. And I'd like to explore that a little bit more. So This particular graphic states a number of different disciplines that we use in public participation, so communications facilitation, public relations mediation, all those kinds of things. But all of these disciplines are really important and they're integral to engagement, but they lack one thing that engagement absolutely needs to have at its heart in order for it to be authentic, and that is a pending decision. A decision that has not yet been made in fact or in spirit. And in the absence of a pending decision or a future decision, there can be no engagement. There would be nothing to engage the public in. There would be nothing to engage this room in, this council in. That's why internationally it's called public participation. They don't, like in an international context, some countries in the world don't like the use of the word stakeholder. So IEP2 believes that every decision defines a set of publics. We would call them stakeholders in this country. And the word participation is, it comes from the concept or the notion that there is a decision-making process, and if you are impacted by it, you have a role to play in making it, to your point. And so clearly, what staff are being instructed in and what the framework requires them to do is to isolate exactly what is the decision to be made. And that is an important entry point into the planning process. It's also a critical stage in the communication continuum. So, being honest and clear with the public, with residents to say, we are, what was one of the examples, what was a big decision that's coming up? We are, give me one. I mean, there's lots that came up today. My brain is filled with them. I'm sorry? So you're looking at, in the social policy field, you're looking at user pay. Age-related, is that the wording? So age-related payment structure, as an example. And so in terms of isolating that decision, it's really important to be able to say, this is the decision that we will make in 3 or 4 or 6 months' time, and we're involving you in this part of it, right? So we're not asking you for permission to make that decision. We're telling you we're going to make it. Now we need to have your input on these areas. And I'd like to just flip over to a different slide deck, just quickly. So lots of times when I make presentations like this, people tell me that this is the most important thing that they remember. So we need to have a decision, and people need to know that we're going to make it. They need to know who's the decision maker and what's the timeline for decision making. We call that the decision statement. Thanks, Debbie. We use that to do an impact analysis in order to identify the stakeholder community and develop a dialogue framework. We'll get there, okay? So I said a lot there, but it's important. One of the things that's important about the decision statement is it defines a scope for, of the decision. So we're talking about age-related payments or discounts for social services, as an example, transit or recreational passes or whatever it is. So we're making a decision that relates to that particular issue. One of the things that staff will do in consultation with you is to say, based on that decision that you are making, what part of it would you like to involve the public and stakeholders in? So we call the differences here the scope of the decision and the scope of the engagement. And this is really critical that we do this at the front end of a decision or of a planning process for engagement, because if we don't tell the public, here's the scope of the decision, we're having this meeting or this online consultation about this particular decision, which is happening at that point in the future, and we want your advice on these elements of it, we also would have to tell them, these are the givens. These are the things that we don't want your advice on. Frankly, because there's no way you could influence the outcome. We have to abide by certain laws. There's only so much money. There's a time frame for this. So those are the givens. And the interesting part about this simple model is that if you don't communicate to your stakeholders what the givens are, they will assume that the scope of the engagement is the scope of the decision, and that you're actually asking them for permission to make that decision. So what staff will do for you is they'll come to you and they'll say, here's the decision statement. We need a sign off on this decision statement. The reason for that is because they will do some sensitivity analysis and some needs analysis based on that decision statement, right? So they're going to do a series of interviews. They'll reach out to their key stakeholders, including some of you or some people that you will recommend that they talk to. And they will say, look, council is going to make this decision 6 months hence. What's important to you? Why would you want to be involved, right? And so what they're developing is they're trying to flesh out that what's in the scope of the engagement. Where can our stakeholders improve this decision? Or on the flip side, where do they need to voice their concerns and aspirations so that we can move this decision-making process forward? Because lots of folks just want to know that they've been heard and you've considered, to your point, that it's been authentic, that it's been compassionate, right? Meaningful and sincere. And we'll circle back to that in about an hour's time.
Thanks for this is really useful. Although just one recent experience, it had to do with a consultation that we hosted. Members of the public came. They complained that they didn't know about it, and they only heard about it from their neighbor the other day. And why did we not let them know about this happening? Then it was communicated what we were there for, where we were looking for the input, and they said, and sort of the givens were communicated to the group, and the group said, well, I didn't know about that, and when did that decision get made, and I wasn't involved, and no one asked me. So, is there a way to, are you suggesting you can just kind of make a statement at the beginning of a session that says, all of this other stuff is a given, and I'm sorry if you didn't hear about it, but we're only talking about this?
Oh, and that's a really insightful question. So here's the thing about, here's why we want to, where do I start with this? It's a big consideration. My undergrad is in forestry. And in that business, we say the best time to plant an oak tree, 100 years ago. The next best time, today. Right? So we're starting to plant these trees and we want to germinate and grow our social capital as a corporation, as a city, right? Most people know about this concept of social capital. It's basically a stock of trust and credibility that you as an organization hold within your community. And what the literature tells us is that when you have a high stock of social capital, trust, credibility, confidence, relationships in the community, you have a strong social license to operate. What does that mean in engagement terms? What that means is when you have a high, can you see, is that pointer there? Okay. When you have a high social capital, you can load up the givens, right? No, true, it's simple. It's like, these are things that we don't want to talk about. We don't have time to talk about them. Trust us, we will act in your best interest in these areas. But we really need your input here, right? And so these are the areas that you've told us because we've done pre-consultation interviews. We've talked to some key stakeholders. We had 8 people that we talked to, and they told us consistently that these things need to be addressed. So we have a long list of givens, not going to talk about, short list of what we call items within our dialogue framework. So a strong social license translates into low transaction costs and time, right? We can do better, cheaper, and we can do business cheaper and better. On the reverse side, though, when there's a low social capital or a weak social license, the reverse is true. People are going to, every step of the way, they're going to challenge you on everything, right? So they're going to want to build a big, long list in the dialogue framework. They're going to want to talk about every really little thing. And sometimes it's just to test you that you're on listen. Nonetheless, it does increase your transaction costs and time. So through the course of some successful engagements, residents, the general public, will come to understand that you're actually on receive. And you have heard them, and you have incorporated their feedback into your decision-making process. Now, another little resource that I've left with you, which is this little postcard here. And, sorry, I stole it actually. I think we should just start with. So when we did our 20 years in business, that was 2 years ago, celebration, we engaged with staff and we engaged with some of our key clients. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create 10 pieces of wisdom that are kind of general operating principles or truths in engagement. And they actually morphed into what we are now calling our company creed. And there's some simple advice there that doesn't matter whether it's a large engagement or a small engagement, whether it's transit or social policy or recreation or land use planning, those are truths that will prevail. And one of the things that's on there is engage on process before content. This is huge, and I need you to really, this totally applies to you as counselors. So what that means is, at the very early stages of an engagement, staff are going to reach out to key stakeholders, and they're going to invite input on how stakeholders, those people who are impacted by the decision, including internal stakeholders like yourselves, want to be engaged and communicated with. And it's only after they've sought that input that because that's part of the planning process. So they will then table an engagement plan or an engagement program. And it will be endorsed by the people who are going to participate in that. That is, that strategy is important for two main reasons. First of all, you're engaging people in the absence of controversy. You haven't talked about content. You haven't had those difficult conversations yet. You've been able to build rapport and demonstrate that you're on listen by engaging on process. So you've built that rapport. The second important reason for doing that is the literature is very clear. When stakeholders have a high degree of ownership and confidence in a process of engagement, they are more likely to accept the results of that engagement, the outputs of that engagement, than if they have no ownership of it at all. Even if the results of that engagement, the decision that you will render, is negative on them.
Thanks. I totally agree with that. And it seems that basically you have to have buy-in if you're gonna in the process. So this goes back to kind of Councillor Holland's question. So when you put up there that you had high social capital and low social capital, and I think there's a lot of things that I've seen in here that the city already does. So it's, in a sense, almost the question is how do we augment those? But in the other scope of this whole thing is, it's not like it's 100% one way and 100% the other way. So again, it kind of goes back to one of my earlier questions. What if you have 90% high social capital with the vast majority of citizens, but you spend a lot of time trying to engage that 10% that no matter how much you do with the process, how transparent you make it, they've just got a different opinion, they don't like the decisions, and then it's the way to sort of attack that is to attack the process. So where's the balance point, and how do you fix that to say your feedback is genuinely appreciated, we'd like it, but there are gonna be times where you're just not gonna like the end decision. That doesn't mean we didn't value the process and the consultation, but how do you create buy-in from, say, a person like that? So 9 out of 10 people in a room think, hey, I agree, that's great, high social capital. How do you reach that person out of 10 that doesn't, that no matter what you do, it seems like you can't gain that social capital? Because that's really what we're trying to do at the end of the day.
So thanks for putting that on the table. And I'd like to address that now because it's a logical flow of this conversation. So there are lots of reasons why people don't buy into a process. Mostly it's because they have an interest that they want to serve, and by buying into that process, it undermines that interest, right? So they're a developer, they own a piece of property, they want to get it rezoned, it's heading in a different direction. So they want to be able to come and sit in those chairs, and when they get their 5 minutes or 2 minutes, they want to be able to say, your decision is illegitimate because I was not engaged and I'm impacted. So staff already know that. That is it's a common strategy for stakeholders for them to be able to protect, where's my pointer, their interests. So what's going to happen now, and what's already started to happen, is in this pre-consultation phase, when staff are reaching out to key stakeholders, and sometimes if it's a big engagement, so we did work for the nuclear industry years ago, and the nuclear industry has a $7 million program in this country over the next 20 years to actually get rid of a whole bunch of contaminated waste that people actually don't even know is in their community. And so we did this engagement around how do you want to be engaged? Like what would be appropriate for you to be able to have a meaningful voice in how we go about siting disposal facilities or storage facilities or routing hazardous waste or those kinds of things. And we started that conversation at the level of what's important to you? Like, we are going to build these facilities. We don't know where they're going to be. So therefore, we don't know where, what communities they're going to go through. We do know the technology that we're going to use to move them, and that's not part of this conversation. It's a given. And we know it has to be stored for up to 99 years. So all of those kind of technical issues, we're not going to talk to you about. What we'd like to talk to you about is, as we go about doing this work, what's most important to you? What do you value? What are your concerns and aspirations? And so what we did was we created a framework of community values around long-term storage of nuclear waste. And it was as legitimate in community X as community Y. And when we started to go to those communities and say, you know what, the bedrock here is at a good depth, and there's accessibility, transportation linkages, and it's not close to body, and the hydrology of the area is good. So this is a possibility. Your region is a good possibility for siting one of these long-term storage facilities. And we need you to know right off the bat that these are the things that are most important to us in terms of values, because we'd already had that conversation with them. And so every part of the decision that we would make is driven by the values that are important to them. And so what we're doing there is we're trying to actually have, rather than have a position-based or even an interest-based conversation, we're trying to have a values-based conversation. We're trying to make sure that the conversation that we're having with neighbor X is as relevant to them as to neighbor Y, because they share those values. So what happens a lot of times, or what has happened in the past, is, and it's happened many times, it's happened to all of us, you get down the track of making a decision, and you announce to the public, we're thinking of doing this. We call that in this business DAD, decide, announce, defend. And so we believe that it's more a better use of public resources to actually use those defense resources as engagement resources, right? So what we'd rather do is, rather than getting positional, stating a position that is kind of, we're thinking of doing this, because what's going to happen is, if we do that, then somebody else is going to come along and say, well, actually, we think you should do that, right? So if council has a position and the community has a different position, what we've just constructed is a debate. And I know that you people are really good debaters, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be here, right? And sometimes you really love a good debate. But I'm just telling you that in this business, debating is not good, because at the end of the day, when you hold a debate, there's a winner and there's a loser, right? So what we want to do is, we want to make sure that we don't have these positional conversations. We don't get into a dad situation where we're actually not speaking to the parties at a distance that couldn't be furthest apart. We want to have these interest-based, like shared interests. What are our common interests? Or even better still, what are our shared values? And staff is going to start doing that work on a regular basis. They actually have worksheets and interview guides that Deb has developed, and they'll be doing that work. It doesn't take long. It's not hard or expensive. But if you don't do it, you wind up having a positional kind of conversation. So we're going to start our conversations now. They're going to be values-driven. And why do we want to do that? Because there are a myriad of positions out there because there are thousands of interests that people bring to a conversation. But if we can actually have a conversation that demonstrates that we have some shared value around quality of life or safety, health and safety, environmental protection, fiscal prudence, value for money, those kinds of things, then not only have we created common ground for action and a central starting place for a productive conversation, we've actually created, as we get into these difficult and kind of sometimes testy conversations, we've created some goodwill that we can reach back to, okay? So a couple of things that we've already covered off that relate to some of the questions that people had wanted to, or some areas that people had wanted to cover. We're not going to have debates. We're going to do a values inventory at the very beginning. We're going to consult on process before content. That's just good practice, and it doesn't take long, and you have a role in that.
Just, I want to talk a little bit about how important, and maybe you can speak to this, the construct definition of what the engagement is all about. I'll give you two examples where I think they were kind of doomed from the start because of conflated issues. We had, for over 30 years, we have a roadway that's in our official plan that's never been successive councils have never supported. We had a park and a really good park design plan that went in, and we hired a good consultant. The problem was, for most of the time, and other councillors may recall this, when we were talking about the park design, which should have been a really good, and we made the best of it, but the reality was most of the people that were in the room wanted to talk about killing that roadway. And another example happens in our planning process. We're now allowed to do community benefit, which I totally support. What we have is at the first statutory meeting process, we try to do the planning, but also talk about community benefit. And 90% of the people are there to say we hate that idea for that development on this location. And then there's a few people there that are there to defend the development. Nobody, and this is held true in every time we've had one of those times when we have put on the agenda, we want to talk about community benefit. Nobody wants to talk about community benefit at the beginning of the process. So that, perhaps you could comment on how you can overcome that.
So in your opinion, sorry to answer a question with a question. Do you get the sense that people don't want to talk about community benefits because then they believe that the development, which they don't support, is a foregone conclusion?
I've had people say, it sounds like let's make a deal.
Exactly. So I would recommend that, just back up a little bit. When we do strategic planning, when anybody does strategic planning, there's a regular framework and a standardized and accepted approach. So it's mission, vision, values, right? So we always have to, even when we're doing strategic planning, we get to a place where we have to kind of understand what values are coming to the table. And the other thing that I think we have to understand is there are some rights that are coming to the table as well. And so like riparian rights, like landowner rights. And so those have to be kind of situated not as values, but as givens. And so I need to say it, engagement is not a substitute for leadership. So sometimes, we get called in to say, okay, now you need to, we want you to engage this community on that issue. And we start doing some investigation and we find that, we're the third company in the last 5 years that's been hired to do the same engagement. And it's because the decision is controversial, right? what this type of engagement will give you is it will give you strength of conviction, because it's in the public interest, it's values driven, and it's been exhaustive in the sense that those people who are impacted by this decision have been brought into the process. We haven't hoped that they'll come. We've actually reached out to them and brought them into this process. A lot of times, like we did an online dialogue before the session today. We did an online engagement or an online survey, and lots of interest around how do you reel in the silent majority. And I think there's some part of what you're speaking to relates to the silent majority, and the squeaky wheels are carrying the day. Well, the role for you is to recruit that silent majority, because those people actually are stakeholders. There's a benefit that they're giving up by their non-participation. And so encouraging those folks to balance the conversation is a role that I think councillors can play. That's part of the answer. I know it's not the whole one, but we'll come back.
Yeah, some of it with the Statutory Meeting Planning Act, I mean, that portion of it, we never get the silent majority that come to the statutory meeting planning. And quite frankly, I'm a little bit reluctant to assume a silent majority, because there's been all kinds of times in my experience on council where people have said, well, there's a silent majority out there. And that hasn't, I mean, that's a convenient argument when the majority of people aren't publicly speaking to your belief structure.
So you've raised another really interesting point, and then I'm going to dive back into the material and keep us moving forward, just because I know you're going to have the manual and you'll want to refer back to it. So I want to create some experience, some discussions, so that we can attach some ideas onto. But to your point, and this is a frustration of mine. I'm a public administrator, right? I worked in the federal government for 15 years, and I know about policies and strategies and business planning. And I have to tell you that the people who wrote the Planning Act were not engagement specialists. For them to say, you have to have a public meeting 60 days before the application, a public meeting, everybody interprets that as a town hall. A town hall meeting is the last of the public policy blood sports. We will never, your staff will never recommend a town hall if I have anything to say about it, right? And a PIS, a public information session, an open house, is not engagement. So, if people, where there is a legislated or even a policy requirement to do engagement, people need to appreciate that that's the floor. That's the minimum requirement. It's not the ceiling. It's actually the stakeholders who define what appropriate engagement is. I'd like you to take a look at your postcards here. So this little postcard, and we're going to get to the spectrum, and I know that most of you have seen the spectrum because you endorsed the framework and you adopted this spectrum. So one of the criticisms, IEP2 Canada sponsored a 2-year-long worldwide engagement on a review of this framework. And the biggest criticism of this spectrum was that Inform is on the spectrum, right? Because every consultation, every engagement has to start at the level of Inform. We have to level the playing field in terms of all of the stakeholders have to have access to factual information so they can engage in a meaningful way. That's why Inform is on the spectrum. But it's not engagement. So if you have a public meeting that's an open house, what's an example of a technique that's at the Inform level? Open house. An open house is a really effective way to inform people, but it is not an engagement technique. If staff have orchestrated a public information session, they have not engaged their stakeholders. But the Planning Act requires that you have one public information session 60 days before the application goes to the city. People who wrote that aren't engagement professionals. So those people who perceive themselves to be significantly impacted in that decision, they want to be engaged. And they go to that open house and they get infuriated because there's no room for engagement. So our engagement investment has actually created as opposed to reduced risk. That's why we need to know about the 140 different techniques that we can use to engage our constituents, our residents. So that's a really important point. You know, like we have to use these techniques wisely. Some of the, I guess to finish the point is, there are some techniques that are very effective at the collaborate level. And if you only want to consult with your residents, then don't go up here, because you've created an expectation now that you're engaging on more than you want to. So that's the design aspects of engagement. So public participation, this is the definition of public participation, or of, and it involves stakeholders in problem solving or decision making, and it creates inputs into decision making. So said differently, an output from an engagement is an input into your decision process. That's all we're trying to do. We're trying to augment your tools for decision making by creating outcomes and outputs in the public domain so that it makes your decision making either easier or better or more durable, right? So why would we involve the public? So there's a couple of things. Actually, I'm going to jump from here to the other slide deck that I'm showing to you. It's a slide deck that I made up for staff. And you have it, I think Deb has it if you want it. So I give it to them at the end of the course because you know, it covers a lot of the concepts that are being discussed, and sometimes they want to use them in presentations. So you actually might get these slides recycled back to a presentation here or a report or whatever, but really there's only 3 reasons why we engage. So there's laws, policies, or legal precedents, and in those cases we must engage. And that is a huge risk, red flag to me. Because if somebody who doesn't know about engagement is reading about this, okay, all I have to do is one public information session 60 days before the application goes forward, we're laughing. And then they don't know that really they haven't engaged. So really important that engagement be appropriate through a needs analysis, and that's what we're talking about today and tomorrow. There's, you know, other triggers for engagement. So if there's been a political commitment that this group has made, that you've made, that the city has made, or if there is evidence or indications that there will be significant impacts of an adverse nature to a stakeholder group, individual, or organization, then you should probably be engaging. If there is a potential for controversy, then public participation is the most effective risk and change management tool that we have as administrators of public policy. No question, lots of literature on that. And if in fact we will be creating winners and losers, then we actually should engage. We need to give those people their day in court, kind of thing. There are other reasons to engage that we should be motivated to consider, and that is to give information. So one of the things that is really, we talk a lot about communication too, and there's lots of communicators in the session, and so we've had some really great conversations and meetings of the minds. One of the things that engineers seem to not understand is if you give people information, then you haven't created understanding. In fact, when an engineer or an architect or some technical person gives a layperson information, typically what they've created is frustration. You know, and so what we need to appreciate as engagement specialists is if we want to help people to understand, the understanding only comes through dialogue. We need to engage them so that they can process that information through the lens of their own reality and the reality of the city in which they live, right? So that's why engagement is important. Sometimes we want to collect information. And lastly, and almost as importantly as the first one, we want to enlist our supporters to have those balanced conversations. So these are the trigger points for engagement. That's the rationale for investing in engagement, because let's face it, investing in engagement takes time, it costs money, and you need to be able to demonstrate value for money. So if it's not going to improve the quality of the decision, if it's not going to shorten the timeline or get you to a decision quicker or cheaper, then we really need to be thinking about why we're engaging. So here are some of the reasons that are listed in your book. They're basically the same. My list is a little bit shorter. So yeah, this one here, like, avoids the controversy and the public veto. You know, what will happen in engagements going forward is a lot of times when we initiate the public part of an engagement process, we've already done internal engagement, so you people have been involved. We've already done key stakeholder engagement. We've already engaged staff, and we may even have consulted online. And so when we engage the broader community, we're actually communicating out, this is what your neighbors are thinking. Now come to this public meeting and we're going to validate and discuss the issues and aspirations that have been uncovered in the engagement process so far. We would never think of engaging a group of people in person right out of the gate. It will never happen. We always work from small group or individual small group formats to larger group formats. If you're bringing people together, or if staff are bringing people together in a large group format, I would hope that it is like the 3rd or 4th or 5th or 10th engagement. They've engaged online, they've engaged over the telephone, they've done telephone town halls, they've done surveys, they've done coffee clutches, they may have done focus groups, right? So we build momentum. Incremental engagement is smart, depending on the scope of the decision and how controversial it is. So here's some of the other from the IEP2 perspective. And this is an important one, like building relationships and enlisting free help. We did an engagement last year on Vancouver Island, and the Douglas Corridor is the town of the regional district of Saanich, is right outside the city limits of the city of Victoria, and it's the major entry point into the downtown core. And they actually call it the Douglas Corridor, but it's really the Douglas community. And it was very, very controversial to do that official community plan because, of course, the city of Victoria and all of the outlying municipalities saw that community as a transportation corridor. But the residents saw it as a vibrant community with lots to offer, and they wanted to be more than a transportation corridor. And so there was potential for controversy, and so our clients asked us what we thought they should do. So we actually formed an advisory committee to develop the engagement plan. We had students from UVic, we had presidents of residents associations, we had members of the Chamber of Commerce, we had all members of different stakeholder groups represented on an 18-member advisory panel, and their terms of reference was to create an engagement plan. And there was such ownership of that plan when we put that on the road, those members of the advisory panel and the resident associations that were represented there, they actually said, we want to do this engagement. We want to attend the pop-ups. We want to do the coffee clutches. We want to do the walkabouts. So it was actually the residents that did the engagement and reported back to us using the tools that we had created. We were able to do much more engagement. We touched many more people than we possibly could have with the budget that was given to us. So this is the next frontier of legitimate engagement, resident-to-resident engagement. And you become the facilitator and the decision maker of that engagement. So, especially with these new technologies that are emerging, we already talked about that. You can stand up a virtual engagement in less than 24 hours, and you can conclude it in less than a week. And it can have thousands of people contributing, right? So we have the technology to be able to do that. And if you can actually bring residents to residences, not only are you getting better decisions, you're doing what this city is all about, what any city is all about. Community cohesion, building relationships, breaking down barriers. We're doing some work for a major city in Canada these days, and who doesn't want to solve homelessness? Right? 600 temporary shelter units for 5 years. What a great idea. People marching on City Hall, not in our neighborhood, right? Engagement, and they didn't get out in front of it. They didn't have a values-based conversation. Too late to reset the engagement, right? Or the funding will pass us by. So getting out in front of those kinds of difficult conversations, having a values-based engagement, really, really important. So just to landmark where we are if you're taking notes or that kind of thing. So we're covered off to, where are we covered off to? We're on page 9 right now. So why to involve the public? It's to your advantage. So any thoughts on kind of why, what's the business case? And at a technical level, if there are no negative or significant impacts, there's no business case, right? We will have a decision statement. You will endorse the decision statement. They will do an impact analysis on that decision statement. If there are very low or no negative impacts, the recommendation to you will be no business case, right? It's cut and dried. Let's give an example. This example comes to us from a small community in Saskatchewan where, hey, there was an election and it came up during the course of the election that, we need a pool, right? So after the election, there was, a bit of a referendum, some conversation, a survey, some talk shows on radio. Everybody wants a pool, right? Great idea, kind of like solving homelessness. So they set about putting aside the money, hiring a contractor, rezoning some land. Let's build a pool. When people started to appreciate the impact that building that pool would have on them, not only in terms of special assessments, but look at the issues that were brought up. And these issues were not brought up during an engagement. They were brought up in the court of public opinion, through the media, through forums like this, where it's not really effective to address those issues. Going to have to cut down trees in the park to make room for that. Like, who wants to cut down trees? Now we're actually having a values-based conversation in a very negative way. It becomes a debate instead of something that brings us together. Right? So the people who are against the pool are still against the pool, but now there's lots more people who are against the pool because they've come to the realization that, hey, there's a negative impact on me. I'm going to lose green space. I'm going to lose parking. I'm going to have a very busy street. All of those kinds of things. So way better to think it through, do an impact analysis on the decision, identify the stakeholders who will be impacted both positively and negatively, and have a proactive, constructive conversation with them, as opposed to fighting a rearguard action. Does this kind of look familiar? And this is a product of DAD, decide, announce, defend, right? What we're going to do now is we're going to take a much more sophisticated, but not an overly expensive or time-consuming approach to do that decision analysis, right? That impact analysis in order to map communities. So I'm going to jump from this particular, I'm on page 9 of your manual, and sorry if I'm creating you, getting you dizzy, but this is the same diagram that I used to show the staff in the session. Actually did it in the webinar, but anyway, it's the same diagram, but I like to animate it. The decisions that you make are rarely simple decisions, right? And so for this particular illustration, I like to use Donella Meadows' concept of system dynamics and complexity, right? So, and Peter Senge's approach to complexity and decision making. So Senge would say, we need to make a decision, and there's a universe of possibilities, and that universe of possibility is represented by the white space on that screen. And there's only one really important variable for that decision, and it's represented by the green dot. And that variable or criterion is, in fact, economic viability. And so anywhere in that green dot is a really good place to be, because it satisfies the requirements of economic viability. That's your solution space. But we know that rarely do you have very simple single criterion decisions that come to you. In fact, let's say this is a two-dimensional problem or decision, technical feasibility. So what's happened to our solution space? Got a lot smaller. What happened to somebody who was really happy with their position? Okay, think about that pyramid again. My position is here in the solution space. I'm really happy there until you introduce this other aspect, cutting down the tree or congestion or parking or whatever it is. Our solution space has shrunk, and now I have to change my position, right? I have to compromise my position. And that is something that people don't do lightly, because they think that if they compromise their position, they're selling out their values. And if you haven't had a values-based conversation with them, it's not easy for them to actually change their position by compromising and moving into the solution space. And we know that, of course, lots of the decisions that you make have many, many variables and factors, and the solution space is really small. And in order to render a compromise from across the stakeholder community, lots of consensus is required. And the trick to getting consensus is to demonstrate that by changing your position, you're not giving out or selling out on your values, you're actually strengthening them, and you're actually still meeting the interests that you bring to this conversation. And staff is going to be able to create those kinds of communication plans now, because they will do that values-based inventory. Is that kind of making sense? It's kind of an important concept. So that's one of the reasons why we pause and talk a lot about values, because that solution space represents durable decisions. If you don't want people carrying loudly from that side or this side of the room, you want to be able to say, well, the position that we heard that safety was important, that leisure was important, and although it it has compromised in some areas between these options, we believe that this option best serves the community in terms of these values that we heard. When you're having a values-based conversation, it resonates with people. If you're debating with them, they just dig in and get more angry. So, looking to page 11 of your manual, and I'll just flip back to where we are in the book here. Oops, sorry. So when not to involve the public, so on page 11, there are 6 considerations for you. I just want to make sure I'm giving you good information here. When to. Okay. There's not alignment between the agenda that's here and the table of contents of the manual, though I'll come back to when to not involve the public. What we're looking at now on page 11 is critical components and considerations for effective public participation. So, okay, and that's when to not involve the public. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of our needs analysis and setting that scope of engagement, right? Like what are the elements of the decision that you can actually ask people for advice on? Well, the first thing is, if you can't do anything with the advice that they're going to give you because there is a law or a regulation, if there are budgetary restrictions, don't ask that question, right? I know there's lots of people who want to give advice on that, and you want them to get engaged, so you want to ask that question, but if they give you advice and you can't take it in the first place, then they'll just say, you weren't listening. This is not a genuine engagement because you haven't reflected my concerns or my aspirations in your decision. So only make promises that you can keep. And I want to go back here to this little card, okay? And I'm going to, I want to show you something that's kind of cool. You have developed a framework of your own. You've adopted the IAP2 spectrum of engagement. And that spectrum of engagement has taken on a number of forms. For the purpose of this slide, just so that people can read it, This particular slide appears a little bit later on in the book. It appears on page 20. The spectrum really tells you about the intensity of the engagement. So just quickly, you'll see up here, the rationale is, the bigger the negative impact, the more to the right on the spectrum you want to be, right? So at the informed level, it's not really a commitment to engagement, it's simply a commitment to keep people informed. At the consult level, what you're doing is you're going to give people some information. We're thinking of doing this, like A, B, or C. What do you think? Can you please comment on A, B, or C so that we can make up our mind? That's at the consult level. At the involved level, what you're basically saying is, we need to make a decision. We want to understand your concerns and aspirations so that we can actually formulate options that are legitimate and address your concerns and aspirations. At the collaborate level, what you're saying is, this is going to be a really hard, complex decision, and we want your brain power, we want your aspirations, we want your energy as part of option formulation. So we're going to have a working group or a workshop, or we want you to work directly with us to help make this decision. At the empower level, what you're really saying is, for that little part of the scope of the engagement, we're going to empower you. As long as you meet all these criteria and you come to consensus, we will adopt whatever you decide. And you have a shining example of an organization that has a very strong culture of consultation. How many people have had dealings with Kingston General Hospital lately? Okay, I don't want to pry, but 10 years ago, Kingston General Hospital was in the bottom quartile of performance of the 141 hospitals in Ontario. And the new CEO came to town and said, we have to do something about this. And the way we're going to do it is through community, patient, and family engagement. And she struck committees, she worked with staff. We did a lot of work in terms of, getting them, the tools that they need, that kind of thing. They stood up advisory committees. Now, today, if you look at the performance, their assessment from Accreditation Canada, they're in the top 25% of hospitals in terms of patient satisfaction, in terms of adverse events, in terms of health outcomes, those kinds of things. That's an organization that said, we are going to improve the quality of our organization by enlisting the support of our customers. Basically, that's what they said. And they're a shining example and studied around, certainly nationally, and I would say internationally as well. And they work, so for example, they're redoing the interior of their hospital a few years ago, and one of the things that was kind of in the project was a new wayfinding system, right? So in hospitals are notorious for people wandering the halls and saying, where the heck am I? And so it's frustrating, and particularly if you have an injury or a condition, or you have a loved one, and you're stressed and they're stressed, and this can be not a good situation. And so what the hospital did was they said, this seems to, it's an older building, and people tend to get lost. And what they said was, look, we are going to take 2 people from staff, 2 family members. We're going to take a security person, 3 patients. We're going to stick you in a room, and we're going to say, look, we want to spend X amount of money on a wayfinding system that works, and it has to mesh with these decor elements. There is, a few regulations in terms of accessibility and mobility. You have to follow those givens as well. But at the end of the day, if you can all agree on what a new wayfinding system would look like, we'll do it. And they did it. And that committee went out and they canvassed people. They had little booths in the lobby. They walked the halls and they talked to people who were lost and say, are you lost? Like, yeah, I'm lost. And it's like, well, what could we do so that you wouldn't get lost? So they actually recruited patients and families and staff, and they were the ones who did the work, and they developed a really smart wayfinding system that is actually a model for hospitals across the province. And so it wasn't the hospital's taking credit for it. And if you go in, they've got all kinds of little, like Kingston General, lots of people used to get lost there, and now not too many people do. Am I close to?
I work at the hospital, so I have a front row seat for thank you for explaining the recent changes. The people that are lost still ask the nurses how to get to the next place, and a lot of the satisfaction has to do with the frontline workers. So it's quite more. I do understand that. I do believe you when you say they've created an engagement strategy and put in the effort, but they didn't actually engage the frontline staff. So that's
So
where
they overlooked staff. That was a.
They tried, but the frontline staff's overworked, so no one went, right? So that's the problem with that.
So word to the wise: staff or stakeholders.
Yes, and there isn't a very much interaction between management and staff at teaching.
And one of the things that we always say is you always engage internally before you engage externally. Like that helps to create an environment of no surprises, and it just leads to better decision making. So I'd be interested to get some more insights if I could afterwards. So anyhow, the one point that I did want to raise in terms of, getting on the spectrum is really important. Making sure that the intensity of the engagement, the investment that you're going to make is appropriate for the decision and the impacts and the way that folks are impacted. But the other thing that I want to point out to you is when you actually specify that level of engagement, you're making a de facto commitment, a contract, a social contract. That second row of that spectrum, whether it's on this card or on that slide, or whether it's in your manual, your framework, the second row of any spectrum anywhere around the world is a promise, or second or third is a promise to the public, right? That's why it's hard to recruit people into an engagement, because they say, well, I showed up, you asked for my input, I didn't see it. Like, you've made your decision now, and I see nowhere where the advice that I gave you or my neighbors gave you, I don't see that reflected anywhere. And so the reason why the spectrum has this promise to the public is it becomes part of your communication plan, right? If you expect people to attend, you need to make a commitment. And that's why it's on the spectrum. So, so don't make promises that you can't keep, and keep your promises, right? So page 11 is kind of advice to senior managers, to decision makers, some of the things that we need to stay at in terms of building our culture of consultation, strengthening our framework, those kinds of things. So helping to clarify the decision to be made. Staff will come to you with a decision statement and look for approval somehow. You will help them to say, look, in this decision, you need to make sure that these three people are involved, because if they're not involved or seem to be involved, the rest of the public will not see this as a legitimate process. So you know what's going on in your communities, so you need to provide that intelligence to staff. So define appropriate level of public. So the level of public participation is this spectrum, right? And a recommendation will come to you, and sometimes you won't agree with it, and sometimes that disagreement is the basis for a good conversation. And it's like staff will more than likely say to you, we think we should be at the involve, collaborate level. And you'll say, well, you know what? We only have time to consult. And so the way that conversation goes is, how are we going to risk manage the difference between collaborate and consult, right? What are we going to do to bridge the gap between the expectations of the public and what we can realistically sign up for? So that becomes an exercise in risk management. And that's what this tool seeks to do, to intelligently manage risks through thoughtful conversations. Understand and accept the core values. So IEP2 has a set of core values. We have posters of them. I think there's a list of them in the book here. On page 23, there are 7 core values. I'll just run through them quickly. Page 23. These are a product of innumerable consultations and engagements that IAP2 has conducted with stakeholders, with members, that kind of thing. And they're kind of truths. So for example, public participation is based on the belief that those people who are affected by the decision have a right to be involved in decision making. So that's kind of like democracy, I think. Public participation includes the promise that your contribution will influence us. That's kind of like what we were just talking about. Don't sign up for more than you can deliver. Used to have a fellow working for us. He was a battle group commander in the Army, Canadian Army. And he would say, oh yeah, I get that. That's kind of like, don't let your mouth sign a check that you can't cash. So don't promise more than you can deliver. Public participation promotes sustainable decisions by recognizing and communicating the needs and interests of all parties, including your own, right? So that's why we do that values-based inventory. That's why we do the impact analysis. That's why we create that dialogue framework. So those issues and aspirations are connected to a need. And we bring those needs into our conversation because conflict comes from one place, unmet needs.
Just while we have this here, I'm just trying to think of an example, because one of the things that's going through my head right now is we already do a lot of this, and so it's, in my mind, it's constantly, how do we get better at what we do, and what phases of this are we missing? So in this instance here, just with the first one, public participation is based on the belief that those who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. So what happens when you have a development that would typically, say, go through a normal planning matter where there would be all this public consultation, and that's kind of what the public's used to. But said developer then, say, flips it to the OMB, which is their right for whatever reason, and now all of a sudden, it's basically like that whole consultation process has now been removed. Now, it seems like the public is looking at the city going, why did you let this happen? But meanwhile, there's legal reasons. So how do you construct that conversation? Because it seems like a lot of what we have to do is educate the public as to what we actually can and cannot control. And then it's framing that conversation to say, this isn't normally how we would do this. This is something that they had a right to do, and now it's gone there. So would it be better to just leave it at that? Or would it be better to now go out and hold public consultations and try to get the public's input, even though that input isn't really going to be part of the decision-making process? So, like, is there a pitfall there? Because they're looking for the city going, we want to be heard, but then in the end, we don't really, say, have any control over the final decision. So have we just basically de facto put ourselves in a position where we're asking for somebody's opinion, they're going to give it to us, and it may not actually factor into the decision at all, and then that's going to now be something that we wore because we asked for their opinion in the first place? It's just kind of an example. It's not related to anything at all going on.
No, I feel your pain, and I've been in that situation. So things go to the OMB when the developer, the owner, believes that their rights aren't being respected, right? And so those riparian rights are givens. And I think it's important and incumbent on this authority, this group, and staff to be sure that the public knows that there are these off-ramps that developers can take through the process. One of the things that we do in our engagement planning is we actually chart out what is the decision-making process. And so if you turn to page 15 of your book, sorry I'm jumping around, I'm trying to be responsive to questions. One of the things that we do, and one of the things that staff will do, is they will actually define what is the decision-making process. And what I'm hearing you say is, we need to make sure that the OMB process is part of this decision-making process, and people need to know that, accommodation has to be given there. And because what's going to happen is we're going to actually construct an engagement process that dovetails to that decision-making process and improves the quality and the outcome of that decision-making process. And so I think a lot of times what happens is in trying to be accommodating of the majority, we actually lose sight of some of those things that are given, and we need, and then, you know, we get our chain pulled at the end of the day. And so I think that by mapping out the decision-making process, by including the OMB process in that decision-making process, there will be a heightened sense of awareness that it doesn't end here. And people need to, I think, their aspirations and their expectations for what can happen through an engagement process and through this authority, there needs to be a sanity check. And I think you've highlighted that, you know, the decision process needs to be inclusive. So, okay. We're now at, I'm just trying to keep track of time. Oh, okay, we got 45. How are we doing for, did we want to take a bio break? And we're good, we're used to this. So we've got 45 minutes left. I want to make sure that all of your concerns and all of, you know, what you kind of expected to get addressed during the course of this evening is realized. So as the clock ticks down, just make sure that if I haven't covered something that's on my list here or has been unsaid yet, that you give voice to it.
So you talked a few minutes ago about the core values of participation, of public participation.
I haven't finished, and I will get through them all.
Okay, so it's on page 23.
Yep.
And it is all about the right to participate in all of those values. But I just wonder how you manage those values when you are in the process of making the decision about which part of this are we going to be engaging on, so that for some people, if you don't follow all of these, so for every single decision, everybody has a right to do all of these because these are your core values. Just wonder what advice you have for us to be able to help to frame it appropriately, so that while we have core values the way we do things, it's not every single situation that you're going to have all of these rights.
So one of the things that staff will be doing, and I don't know if you will see these kinds of tools, you will if you ask for an engagement plan or a report. This is one of the things that staff do. So on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a worksheet. It's called an impact analysis and a stakeholder impact analysis. And so they will have collected certain information through key stakeholder interviews, and they will have enumerated all of the impacts. So this is a section of, you know, that checklist or that worksheet. And there may be a dozen, 18 impacts. And then each stakeholder who is potentially impacted will be identified. And the level of impact will be assessed high, medium, or low. And then there will be an overall ranking. And so it is this work that takes probably 2 or 3 people. I'm going to say a 2.5, 3 hour meeting to complete this checklist for a large project. It is the results of this impact analysis that lands us on the spectrum, that actually determines whether or not we're going to engage at all. This is what makes the business case for an investment. And so if people say, hey, I have a right to be engaged, you know, you're able to say, well, look, we did an impact analysis, and sure, you are negatively impacted. Our assessment was low. Maybe we missed something. Can you tell us why you think that, you know, it should have been higher? So we can now have that kind of fact-based conversation. The other thing is this whole test of reasonableness. We are not going to engage on every single decision that is made. That's why that spectrum is a dial and not a switch, right? That's why they're going to come to this body and they're going to say, hey, we don't think, you know, here's the decision statement. Okay, thanks very much. We'll come back to you. We'll do the analysis. I would say that 7 times out of 10, staff would say, no need to. And actually, over time, they will come back to you more and more often to say, we're all good, don't think we need to engage. Sometimes for these big projects, they're going to do this kind of analysis and they're going to say, you know what, there are winners and losers, or there is a potential for controversy, or there will be negative media. We need to engage. We need to get ahead of this. This is a risk. So to answer your question directly, these things need to meet the test of reasonableness. And to say that everybody has a right to be engaged on every decision is really not true. They need to be engaged. And if you look at, sorry, I'm going to flip again. If you look at the spectrum, it's very clear. At the top, it says the increasing level of public impact. It's a gauge. Like, we need to calibrate our investment in engagement with the significance of the impact, right? Did I answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So going back to the values then, I just wanted to cover them because one of your roles in the corporation is actually to walk the talk. And the easiest way to do that is to check in with yourself regularly whether or not you're meeting the values, right? So we left off on number 4, public participation seeks out and facilitates those potentially affected by or interested in a decision. The wording on this is quite interesting because very deliberately, this value places the onus on the city to do that impact analysis, to identify, and there was a concern raised or a comment raised at the beginning, there are those marginalized individuals that we don't typically see. There are those apathetic stakeholder groups that typically don't show up, get involved. And then there's the silent majority who is in fact positively impacted, but don't really know it. And what this value tells us is that it's actually our job to bring them into the process. And with the technology that we have these days, it's actually getting easier and easier, cheaper and cheaper day by day. So it places the onus on the decision maker to bring folks who are impacted into the engagement, which is kind of an interesting twist. And I would say that 10 years ago, people would kind of go, are you kidding me? If they want to get engaged and influence me, they should show up. But that just doesn't make for good decision making. Number 5, public participation seeks input from participants and how they want to design participation. I already talked about that. We engage on process before content. It just makes sense, right? You can build rapport and engage your stakeholders in the absence of controversy. You build a process that has integrity and has ownership, and whatever comes out the other end is more likely to be accepted as legitimate. So it's a value, but it's also good for business. Public participation provides participants with the information that they need. We need to level the playing field. It's not acceptable anymore to send a 200-page PDF document to a stakeholder 2 days before a public meeting, right? It just creates frustration, anger, and resentment. That we've got all kinds of great tools now. We've got, infographics, and we've got podcasts and video and all kinds of things. And I share with the group all of the videos that we've made. In 2.5 minutes, you can communicate a huge amount of information and set expectations for people who come to a public meeting. Let me give you a scenario here. And this is technology that is freely available. So we did a very controversial engagement last year in the city of Calgary, and we were trying to cut money out of the school budget. And we had 15 public meetings in 2 different weeks. So we had 5 meetings on a Tuesday of that week, and then 5 more meetings on that Thursday. And then the next week we had 5 meetings on the Wednesday. And the reason for that is because, there were advocates that we didn't want to overwhelm meetings. So we had consecutive meetings sort of to disperse the negative energy. The other thing was these were being staged at schools. And we didn't want to have really angry crowds. So we said the most people who should show up would be 50. So we used a little platform called Eventbrite. Have people used Eventbrite? Of course. So it's a great online platform for promoting events and for extending invitations. It'll issue tickets. You have access to that very high-powered technology for free. Okay, because you're a not-for-profit organization, part of their corporate social responsibility is you can use it for free. So what we did was we promoted it through Eventbrite. We drove people to the Eventbrite website. They had to register, so we controlled the number of people. When they got their confirmation that they were registered for an event, it actually came with a link. And when they and our confirmation said, "Thanks very much for attending this session. We look forward to seeing you there. Please watch this 3-minute video before you come to the meeting." So right there, we were able to reach out to people and start informing them right away. Now, it turns out when we registered people and checked that they had registered, we asked them, "Did you watch the video?" And only about 40% of the people actually watched the video. So all we did was at the beginning of these public meetings, we showed the video and we had a Q&A session. So it kind of leveled the playing field, and everybody had the same information before we started the conversation. So people need information in order to participate in a meaningful way. I left this slide up here for this conversation. Just because inform is on the spectrum of engagement does not mean that if you informed people, they have been engaged. Because of the definition of what engagement is, if they haven't had the opportunity to influence your decision-making, they have not been engaged. So bringing people to an open house or sending them to a website is not engaging them. It's informing them, and that's a great starting place, but unless we move up on the spectrum, they haven't been engaged. Public participation communicates to participants how input affected the decision. So this is something that came up when we went around the table at the beginning, how to demonstrate that the process was sincere. Not only is it a value, a core value, it is how you cash in your return on investment. If people can't see how their voice influenced the decision, they will see your overall engagement as illegitimate, and by extension, the decision itself as suspect. So there's a couple of things going on here. If you scope your decision statement and you communicate, this is what we're trying to decide. Here's the scope of the engagement. This is where you have a role in that decision. Here are the givens. This is kind of a no-fly zone. Okay, so we've created that space. So now what we can do is we can say, okay, we got this information about the scope of engagement. Now we can feed back to people, here's how we used your advice, or here's why we couldn't. Okay, we just went through that with a client. They got 780 responses to an online survey. Sadly, against our better judgment, they had an open text field as the last question. 42% of the people who completed that field made a comment that was outside the scope of the engagement. Frankly, it was outside the scope of the decision. So it was quite easy for them to say, and we reported these themes in this question or response to this question, and X percentage of responses that were out of scope related to this, and X percentage related to that, and we're not going to address that input because it's out of scope.
Just a quick question. I understand where you're going with the scope and everything and kind of framing the conversation in the context of what public input can actually be used and how we can get that input and how that'll factor into the decision. Will there be, when you start putting answers in boxes sort of saying, this is the given, this is kind of the no-fly zone, and I think you know where I'm going here, is will there be initial resistance to that from the public? Because in the past, and I can think of a perfect example that I just did on a Facebook group that I run, is if you ask a very open question, you exactly get what you mentioned earlier. You start to get opinions, then you start to get debates, and then you start to actually get away from what the initial question was. It could be as simple as, should this be 1 lane or 2 lanes for a bike path? Should it go one direction or both directions? So if you start to say, there's going to be a bike path, I guess, could you give an example where you would use the scope in the frame of a question would be one thing, and then is there going to be initial resistance when we start doing this? Do you have to create that buy-in over time? Because I could see somebody that's skeptical going, well, the city's asking, for our consultation, but then they're basically telling us what they want to hear it on. So it could seem like a skeptical person could go, why are you telling me
what you want to hear, rather than just saying, what's the main question, right?
So the point about the decision statement is, a lot of times, we talked a lot about, how do we get to a place where we've decided to decide? And there was somebody from the mayor's office there, somebody from the clerk's office there, and there were, some senior people there too. And basically what we sorted out was, there's an incident, right? Something happens and it comes to the attention of this group and you are compelled to act. There's a complaint and it's chronic and there's substance to it and you're compelled to act. There's some fact finding, there's a survey, there's a review, some data comes to this authority and you're compelled to act. And so in those regards, the response is simple. Like, we are attending to the public interest and we have a duty of service and we are compelled to act. So we will make this decision. So your neighbors down the road are kind of struggling with this whole new landfill thing. So Northumberland County is running out of space in their landfill, and they just had an engagement. Are we going to ship this stuff away, or are we going to deal with our own waste? And basically the residents say, well, we made it waste, so we should deal with it. Fine. So now the question is, so the decision is, we're going to build a landfill. That's the decision statement, and it needs to be open by 4 years from now because we're running out of room. So that's really easy. We're compelled to act. Where's it going to go? That's the big, that's the $99 question. And so I think there's been sufficient conversation in that community where there's been a collective realization to say, okay, it's a legitimate decision. The question now becomes, is that scope of engagement big enough, to legitimize the public process, right? So, are we going to consult, in terms of that landfill, the thickness or the construction or composition of the liner, the type of material that can go in there, or what is of meaning to the stakeholders? That comes from your dialogue framework, which comes from your impact analysis. So when I was showing you, this is a high, medium, and low, plus or minus. If you want to talk about stuff that is low negative, but there are things on that framework that are high negative, you'll get called on it. So it's actually quite straightforward. You do an impact analysis. You got the best brains in your organization sitting on a 3 or 4 member P2 planning team, including technical expertise. You can look at that impact analysis, and it's kind of like and that's atypical, or you can get that through Freedom of Information. So it's pretty clear. The higher the level of impact in a significant, a negative way, that defines your scope of engagement. Did I answer your question? Yeah, so it's that impact analysis and then the sincerity piece of it coming back around, like reporting back, that's the 7th value. If you can't report on how you used their input or why you couldn't, then people will, then your overall engagement process is suspect. And it's simple to do. It's a report to council. The minutes are attached to a plan, a findings report on engagement. It's all themed out, and there's a page there to say, this input has been integrated into the decision, and this couldn't be for these reasons. It's quite simple. It's part of your commitment, right? You made a promise to the public. So it's really important to deliver on it. So we're still talking about critical pieces. You should know too that, let me just find out where I am in your critical components. Right. So this is where we ensure that public participation process is aligned with the decision process and is driven by public participation objectives that reflect organizational and process values. And also that's meaningful, that there are impacts and concerns that people have that get talked about. One of the things that you should know is that a public engagement plan might come to you, or you might ask to look at it. And that plan will have a decision statement, it will have an impact analysis, And then it will have a set of engagement objectives. And the really cool part about engagement objectives are they're categorized in two different buckets. So one bucket is called outcomes, and the other bucket is called outputs. And each plan will have anywhere from 4 to 8 objectives. And they will be broken down in terms of outcomes and outputs. And one of the really cool things about investing in engagement is you can put an outcome objective as build trust in the city, build confidence in council, ensure legitimacy for this decision process. I mean, you can put really socially cohesive kinds of objectives into an engagement plan, and once they're in there, you will bake that into the design, or staff will bake that into the design. And we are looking at 140 different ways to bring people together in order to achieve those objectives. So those outcome objectives are really, really important. They include things like build understanding, build respect, deepen trust-based relationships between stakeholders, those kinds of things. They'll also include outputs, kind of like we need a list of priorities, we need a list of options, we need to categorize values, we need a list of stakeholders, all of those kinds of things. And if you have, and here's the thing that you need to remember, you are a core stakeholder. You are, in a lot of cases, the decision maker. If you have specific objectives, nonpartisan objectives, that you feel need to be accomplished through this engagement, you need to tell staff. And you will have the opportunity to do that. So the fourth touch point, staff will come to you, and we need to figure out, or you need to figure out how this happens. It's probably just going to be a memo, to Debbie, and Debbie's going to shoot it up to Dennis, and Dennis will look at it and say, yeah, it looks good to me, or should go to council, and maybe it's an update, maybe it's a bullet, I don't know. But you have to own that process, right? Because at the end of the day, you will be seen to own it, right? So you better be okay with it. The other side of that is if there are things that you feel need to be accomplished, then put it in the plan, right? Because we can do really great things with these engagements. We can bring people together, we can build cohesion, we can restore broken relationships, we can mend fences, right? So this is a very powerful tool. So, and then of course the other thing is, a critical component is holding staff accountable for how they did the engagement. Every engagement will have an evaluation framework. Sometimes it'll just be simple and short. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more sophisticated. But one of the things that it will always have is an evaluation framework. And the reason why it has a really coherent evaluation framework is because the objectives that I just talked about will become measures, right? So they will have to word things in a way that they can be measured, right? And so Debbie and Dennis are going to be holding people accountable for, did you do this the way you said you were going to do it, and did you get the results that you expected, that we invested in, right? So we will always be, like, going forward in your framework, in the protocol, there is an element of evaluation required. And it's good. It's part of continuous improvement. It's a part of sharing lessons learned. It's part of building the practice. It's an important part of what we do. So now getting to the kind of where the rubber hits the road from your perspective, what is your specific role? I've alluded to it across the entire presentation. Oh, by the way, before I go there, I'm on page 27, but on page 26, just for your information, this is kind of interesting. This is that international protocol. This is the one that you actually signed up to. This is the protocol that every municipality across the country uses to do engagement planning. Every Ministry of Health in every province has signed up and uses this. They have adapted it in a way that meets their needs. I know because in a lot of cases we were the ones who did that work. So it's very robust, it's very rigorous, and it's very inclusive. Internally, it brings together a small group of 3 or 4, maybe even 5 people to develop a plan, and these are the steps that they follow. Each step represents a meeting of anywhere from 45 minutes to 2.5 hours, right? So we're not asking, like, we've tried to streamline this as much as possible. And because planning, for the most part, is a linear process, if you actually put the meat in this end, the sausage comes out this end, right? I mean, it's not really that kind of straightforward, but, you know, there's some critical thinking that needs to go in here. But if you follow the process kind of rigorously, you come up with a really good plan. And that's why you've adopted it, and that's why you've baked it into your policies and procedures. So that's the process that staff is following now. And like I said, each one of these steps is a meeting of anywhere from 45 minutes to 2.5 hours. And at the end of the day, they will produce an engagement plan of anywhere from 4 to 6 pages, and it will probably have a communication plan appended to it that is a page and a half. Is that, are we in the zone? Yeah, that's usually what it is. But that's the process that they follow. So we're kind of coming to the end of our presentation here. A few things on page 28 that, you know, this is ground that we've already covered more or less. So your role for decision makers, like we talked about the donut, right? What I call the donut, you know, scope of decision, scope of engagement. Here are the givens. Like, if you're not prepared to talk about something, if you're not prepared to put that inside the scope of engagement, you be darn sure you tell staff. You know, that's a no-fly zone. Now, having said that, we're doing work for a very large city. Now, they're trying to put some temporary housing in homeless shelters. And they said, as a council, we're not prepared to for our homeless to actually spend another winter on the street. We've got an opportunity to put in 600 temporary shelters. We're going to do it. So they got 2 in, and then the protest started. So just because you're committed to something doesn't mean it's not worthy of engagement, because the purpose of engagement is reduce transaction cost and time, right? So in fact, if you are really committed to it, then think about how you want to engage the public so that you can get them on side, right? So just because you're committed to it is not, you know, a rationale for not doing engagement. So we have some really great champions of the engagement process. They've got the charter, they've got the framework, they're doing the training, they're raising awareness. You've got all of the pieces in place. Now what we need to do is make sure that the rubber hits the road and we get some traction on them. So there's one thing to put those tools in play. I think the more important thing, in my view, is to now create demand for the use of those tools. Like, ask, where are you on the spectrum? What are your objectives? What is the decision statement? I want to see that impact analysis, right? I want to make sure that my stakeholders, my constituents, the people I'm accountable for, have been included in this engagement plan. Create the demand for that, right? You know what the tools are, make sure that they get used, because let's face it, we're in the midst of a change process. This is a new protocol, right? This is all new. And, you know, I would hazard a guess that 100% of staff and yourselves don't have 3 extra hours every week that they're looking to fill. And they're all booked up. So this is displacing something, right? We need to create a demand for that displacement, you know, positive deviance. So consider the input that you get. You will get those 4 things. You know, here, are you the decision maker? Is this a good decision statement? Is this the right stakeholder community? And are these all the issues and aspirations that we need to be discussing, right? Give feedback. They're not long documents, right? But they're important. They're strategic. Oh, so, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how to put this gingerly, you're going to wear this, right? I mean, you're the public face of the corporation. So one of the things that you need to be aware of is you don't have to be aware of all of the input that was received, but you should be at least aware of some of the 3 to 5 things that actually influenced you in making your decision, right? That's the return on investment. That's how you grow your social capital. That's how you strengthen your license. That's how people come to have confidence and trust in this authority. So explain to people, get that information, and make sure that it is delivered in plain language. And so we're closing in on some of the things that, of course, this is something that if you can't actually collaborate with people in developing options for a new city plan or a transportation strategy or, parks and leisure program, whatever it is, don't commit to that. Say it would be nice if we could, but we don't have the time or resources for that. The best we can do is this or that, right? So use that spectrum to calibrate and align what's reasonable in terms of getting people involved in the decision-making process and the resources that are available to do that. A lot of times you're going to be at the consult-involved level of the spectrum. A lot of times people want to collaborate with you and it's just not going to be possible. Managing those expectations is really important. And that's the message that we're giving to staff. And so when staff come to you and say, we should be collaborating on this one, because if we don't, we're looking down the barrel of a world of hurt. So that's not going to happen all that often, but sometimes they'll come to you and say, like this, we're looking at workshops, we're looking at a significant investment here, we're going to have a future search over here at the Holiday Inn, and we'd like you to attend. Or we're going to have a World Cafe, it's going to be a day and a half workshop, whatever it is, right? So have the confidence that when staff come to you with a plan, that it's been well thought through. They've done the impact analysis based on a decision statement that you've approved. They've defined that stakeholder community. They've reached out to that stakeholder community and they've tested what the expectations are. They've done a risk analysis in terms of where you should be on the spectrum, and they're making a thought-filled recommendation based on a consensus of the 3 to 5 people that are the best people to make that recommendation to you, right? So that's how this process works. We form a little team and they use their professional judgment, their experience, and their technical expertise to render decisions to you or recommendations to you in terms of where you should be on the spectrum for any given decision or engagement supporting a decision. And then, of course, it makes sense that we have to deliver on the promises that we make. So just in terms of getting traction for advice and insight of decision processes, one of the things that this, there's this balancing act between the relationship that you hold with a stakeholder group, a constituent, a neighborhood association, whatever, the content of the conversation that you're having. Sometimes it's good news, community investment, upgrades, whatever it is, and there's a process by which you have that conversation. And one of the things that the work that's being done here is we're really focusing on the process so that we can have difficult conversations in a civilized and productive way, so that we can take that content and use it as a platform to build relationships, community cohesion, trust, and confidence in this authority. So those are the kind of aspirations of, and I think that's my last slide. Okay, the summary. The summary is what's left unsaid. We've got 10 minutes. I wanted 15, but anyway, what's left unsaid? I'm just going to run through what you asked that we talk about. So strategies for engaging the unusual suspects. I don't know what more I can say. It's our job to reach out to them once we've identified them. Oh, and the other thing that I haven't said, and this is really important, let's make it fun. We're community builders here. We're engaging people to make better, more durable decisions. Let's make it fun. It's pretty easy to do if we set our mind to it. So expectations of the public in civil, so you create those expectations. You've got these guidelines, dialogue guidelines. these were developed by your residents, and they need to be promoted. And we're giving, and that's a question that came from staff. Just some advice, that I can carry back to them, or Debbie or Dennis can carry back. These guidelines are guidelines that were developed by residents of Kingston, and that's their expectations to convene a civilized conversation. What would you think if you heard that one of the staff people actually shut down a public meeting because people would not follow these guidelines? How would you react? Or what advice could you offer to staff who are put in that, and they are put in that situation?
This is some advice based on experience with another organization where we have the guidelines, the principles of participating in the discussion, and we also designate 2 staff people or 2 representatives at the meeting who enforce the guidelines. So it's not the chair's responsibility to kick someone out of the room. It would be the role of staff, for example. And so in that case, it's announced at the beginning of the meeting, these 2 people are here, and they will intervene if anything goes wrong. And so it's not, it sounds dramatic, but it's not, it really happens. And it's not a shock because everyone knows that the expectation is set that they will be removed, and they know who will remove them. So
Cool.
that might help.
So I think setting those expectations at the very beginning and being prepared. Is that kind of what your expectations as a group are? And these work for you too, right? So if you're convening discussions with constituents or residents associations, that kind of thing, please.
Actually, I keep thinking, what are some of the decisions coming up? And we do have one that's kind of unique in my area. Staff have already started to do a lot of work on creating a historic designation for Portsmouth, the old part of the city that's closely aligned to the penitentiary, where everyone used to live. Yeah. It's very lot of little buildings. It's close to the water, and so as a city, we've done a lot of work. I'm certainly very supportive, but we've actually discovered that the community association, who have quite a bit of say, aren't too keen on this. So if we moved ahead right now, this would be the first historic area that was moved, we moved forward without the push from the community associations. So what I'm hoping is that we can get the community association interested enough to push. But so it's interesting as I've listened to you thinking about, what's the decision, what are the goals, what are the values, what, do we care about heritage? There's been a lot of food for thought with this one because it is a decision that will be coming up soon. We're either going to do it or forget it because the place won't look the same in 5 or 10 years because it's just becoming too fabulous a place to live. So, yeah, that is a big one that's coming up, actually.
And so as humans, I think we have an affinity and a sense of entitlement based on geographic proximity. And I think that's what's happening here, right? It's like, I've lived in the shadow of this for X number of years, and now it's my time to shine. And I have a right to be more influential in this conversation than anybody else. Is that kind of what's going on? A little bit of entitlement that we're dealing with here?
In that the 2 areas that are currently designated, it was a push from the community association. We must be protected. There's a bit more of a feeling of we don't want to be protected because we're all going to make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So, it's an interesting, whereas the city value is heritage. The city value is protecting heritage. In this case, a community value isn't sure whether they want to cash in, enjoy the fruits of living there forever. So it's, again, interesting in the context of, what you've been discussing, how to engage. For someone like me, I would like to engage to persuade everyone it's a great idea to push the council and staff to create a heritage district?
So, the way you framed it is perfect. We have a certain set of values that define a particular approach or position. We have another set of values that actually push us in a different direction and a different position, both of which could be legitimate. What would happen if we brought those 2 or 3 or 4 sets of values and the people that kind of give voice to those values together to say, how can we make a decision that satisfies all of these values? And that's really the magic of public participation. It's not really magic or voodoo or anything like that, but that's where really good public policy gets crystallized. It's not here. Well, it can happen here, but it usually happens out there, right? That's where people see the benefits of a different approach, where they recognize that a particular value that isn't theirs is still legitimate and that they will abide it and incorporate it into their value set as well. So we are facilitators of those kinds of conversations, and staff can actually structure those engagements to create that kind of product. I think the way you framed it is absolutely appropriate. And there's lots of techniques that we could use to actually work with that, to come up with some outcomes and some outputs that would be, I think, satisfactory for all parties concerned. At the end of the day, though, we need a decision statement. Like, we're going to actually have a plan that defines how this area will be developed over the next 20 years. Now, let's set our collective minds to work on that.
On just using that same example, so part of the process would be to collect information from the silent majority and the unsurprised apathetics, which are far more numerous in Portsmouth than the Portsmouth District Association. Just as a thing, what you might have there is a group that, some entitlement possibly, but a group that has been involved for a long time, that is recognized as leaders of a certain faction, but they're not necessarily representative of those larger groups that are not as engaged, which is the point of having a strategy. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? I mean,
absolutely. And so what would happen in a perfect world is we would have kind of bilateral engagements with all of those groups to really tease out kind of what's really going on with them. We would bring that together into a report on preliminary engagement. We would actually publish that across the entire stakeholder group. So we're going from stakeholder engagement to multi-stakeholder engagement, and have a conversation and create that space using these kinds of guidelines and a facilitated, structured conversation to say, now we're going to explore each one of these and come up with some kind of composite that works for everyone. I mean, it's that easy and that difficult. And it's probably not going to happen in the course of a month or a weekend. It's probably a year, or, I mean, probably know that better than I. So it's 8:00. I really enjoyed meeting you. And one of the things that I didn't say that I'm a little bit remiss in, I've been working in public policy my entire life, professional life, and I could never do your job. I could never be an elected official. I just, I'm an administrator. But I so admire the work that you do. You're here tonight. You're giving up family time. You're giving up personal time. And I just want you to know that it's appreciated. And I think the work that I do is going to backstop, the hours and the effort and the energy that you're putting in to your role as elected officials. But I just want you to know that it is appreciated. So good luck going forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so with that, we will move forward to ask for a motion to rise from Committee of the Whole, please.
Moved by, just a second here. Moved by Deputy Mayor Neal, seconded by Councillor Osterhoff, that council rise from the Committee of the Whole without reporting.
Please vote. And that carries. Is there any other business? Mr. Clerk, will ask for bylaws, please.
Moved by Councillor Shell, seconded by Councillor Osanek, that Bylaw 1 be given its first and second reading.
Please vote. That carries.
Moved by Councillor Shell, seconded by Councillor Osanek, that Bylaw 1 be given its third reading.
Please vote. That carries. Motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Councillor Candon, seconded by Councillor Bohm. Please vote. And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.